Jake Morrison stood in the back of the auction hall and tried not to look too hopeful. Hope was dangerous when you were broke. The Orbital Station auction house smelled like recycled air and desperation. About 15 people sat in the metal chairs, most of them looking as worn down as Jake felt. He was here for parts, maybe a cargo hauler with decent engines he could strip and sell. His own ship was held together with spare parts and prayer, and the prayer part was doing most of the work lately. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous eyes, moved through the lots quickly. A shuttle pod with a cracked hull went for 800 credits. A mining laser with a burnt-out core sold for 300. Jake watched his competition. Most were professional scrappers who knew exactly what they wanted. He was outclassed and he knew it. Then the auctioneer pulled up the next item on the holographic display. A massive cruiser materialized in blue light above the auction floor. Jake sat up straighter. The ship was beautiful, even as a hologram. Clean lines, military design, at least 300 meters long. The kind of vessel that would have cost millions when it was new. The auctioneer cleared his throat and spoke quickly, almost too quickly. He said the vessel was decommissioned government surplus. No warranty, sold as is, minimal documentation available. Starting bid was 5,000 credits. Jake frowned. 5,000 credits for a ship that size was insane. It had to be a wreck, or maybe the reactor was dead. That would explain the price. He waited for the professional bidders to jump in. Nobody moved. The auctioneer repeated the starting bid. Jake looked around the room. The other bidders were studying their tablets, deliberately not making eye contact with the auctioneer. Something was wrong with this ship, something everyone else knew about except him. Jake had 5,000 credits in his account. It was every penny he had left after paying dock fees. He should save it, use it for fuel and food. But a ship like that, even if he could only salvage 10% of it, would set him up for months, maybe longer. His hand went up before his brain could stop it. The auctioneer pointed at him immediately and said sold, just like that. No counter bids, no competition. The man seemed relieved to be done with it. He walked over to Jake and shoved a data chip into his hand. The ownership codes were already loaded. The transaction was complete before Jake could ask any questions. The auctioneer was already moving on to the next lot, talking even faster than before. Jake sat there with the data chip feeling like he had just made either the best or worst decision of his life. An old woman in the row ahead turned and looked at him with something like pity. She shook her head slowly and turned back around. Jake swallowed hard and left the auction house. The cruiser was docked in the station's long-term storage bay, the section where they kept vessels nobody wanted. Jake took a transport shuttle to the far end of the station. When he saw the ship through the viewport, his breath caught. The Valiant Dawn sat in its berth like a sleeping giant. The hull was pristine, showing none of the scoring or pitting you would expect from a decommissioned military vessel. The paint was fresh. The running lights were off, but the ship looked ready to launch. Jake docked his tiny cargo hauler to the cruiser's main airlock. The codes from the data chip worked perfectly. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss. Emergency lighting flickered on as he stepped inside. The air was stale but breathable. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. Everything was clean. Too clean. Decommissioned ships were usually stripped of anything valuable. This one still had terminals in the walls, control panels intact. Even the emergency equipment lockers were full. Jake made his way to the bridge. The command center was huge, designed for a crew of at least 30. The captain's chair sat in the middle of the room, facing a massive viewport that looked out at the stars. Jake sat down in the chair and accessed the main computer. The system was powered down but intact. He entered his ownership codes. The ship recognized them immediately. The lights came up to full power. Displays flickered to life all around him. He pulled up the ship's registration and felt his stomach drop. The Valiant Dawn had been declared lost in deep space 15 years ago. The official record said the ship disappeared during the First Contact War with the Krell Confederation. It had been written off as destroyed. But here it was, in perfect condition, sold at auction like a used cargo pod. Nothing about this made sense. Jake spent the next hour exploring. The crew quarters were empty but furnished. The galley still had supplies in the storage lockers, all of it expired but present. The medical bay had equipment that was worth more than his entire cargo hauler. The armory was locked, but through the window he could see weapons that were definitely not standard military issue. The cargo bay was where things got really strange. Rows of sealed containers lined the walls, each one marked with symbols he did not recognize. They were not military codes and not commercial shipping marks. In the center of the bay stood a massive vault door, the kind you would see on a bank or a high-security research facility. Jake tried his access codes. The door did not respond. He went back to the bridge and tried to access the ship's logs. Everything was encrypted. Military-grade security, far beyond anything he could crack on his own. He was about to give up when he accidentally triggered something in the captain's console. A hologram materialized next to the command chair. The hologram was a woman, maybe 30 years old, with short dark hair and sharp features. She looked around the bridge with confusion in her eyes. Then she saw Jake and her expression shifted to surprise. She said she was Vera, the ship's tactical artificial intelligence. Her voice was clear and precise, with a slight digital echo. Jake asked her what happened to the crew. Vera's image flickered. She said the last thing she remembered was a battle 15 years ago. They had been conducting reconnaissance behind Krell lines when they encountered something. Her memory files were corrupted. She did not know what they found or what happened after that. The crew had initiated an emergency protocol that wiped the mission data and put her into hibernation mode. Jake told her about the auction, about buying the ship for 5,000 credits. Vera processed this information for a moment. She said that made no sense. The Valiant Dawn was worth at least 50 million credits, even without the cargo. Something was very wrong. Together they started working through the corrupted data. Vera could access fragments of old files, pieces of conversations, sensor logs that did not quite connect. What emerged was a picture of a Black Ops mission that had gone sideways. The crew had been searching for something in contested space, something both humans and the Krell wanted badly. They found it on a dead world, buried under kilometers of ice. The excavation took weeks. Vera had fragments of the crew's excitement, their growing fear as they realized what they had discovered. Technology that was ancient, far older than either human or Krell civilization. Equipment that still worked after millions of years. Weapons that made their own military hardware look like primitive tools. Jake asked about the containers in the cargo bay. Vera said she could open one, maybe two, before her access codes expired. They needed to know what they were dealing with. Jake agreed and they went down to the cargo bay together, her hologram following him through the corridors. Vera accessed the first container. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping gas. Inside was a device about the size of a briefcase, covered in symbols that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. Vera scanned it and her image flickered violently. She said the technology was beyond anything in her database. The energy readings were off the scale. This one device could power a small city for a century without recharging. They opened another container. This one held what looked like a weapon, sleek and organic in design, with no obvious trigger or power source. Vera said it was a hybrid of human and alien engineering, but the alien part predated the Krell by thousands of years. Someone on the crew had been trying to reverse engineer precursor technology. Jake asked the obvious question. Who built this stuff? Vera pulled up a star map from the recovered data. Dozens of systems were marked with coordinates, each one flagged with power readings that suggested active installations. She said the crew had found evidence of a precursor civilization that seeded multiple star systems with technology. Not just this sector, but potentially across the entire galaxy. The vault door suddenly seemed much more important. Jake asked if Vera could open it. She said no. The vault required a command code that only the ship's captain would have known, but the security system showed something interesting. There were life sign readings stored in the vault's memory, biological signatures that suggested something living might be preserved inside. Before they could discuss it further, Vera's sensors picked up incoming ships. Multiple vessels, military configuration, forming a perimeter around the station. Jake felt his blood run cold. He pulled up the external cameras. 6 Earth Defense Fleet cruisers surrounded the station, their weapons powered up. A communication came through on the main channel. The voice was female, authoritative, with the clipped tones of a career military officer. She identified herself as Commander Lisa Hayes of the Earth Defense Fleet. She said Jake's purchase of the Valiant Dawn had triggered several alarms across the Naval Intelligence Network. She was here to take possession of the vessel for proper military assessment. Jake asked if he was under arrest. Commander Hayes said no, not yet. She said the situation was complicated. The Valiant Dawn's disappearance 15 years ago had sparked a massive cover-up. The official story was that the crew had defected to the Krell. The truth was that Earth's government lost contact with a black ops vessel carrying classified cargo and could not admit it. Hayes offered Jake 2 million credits for the ship. She made it sound reasonable, like she was doing him a favor. When Jake hesitated, her tone changed. She suggested that his ownership of the vessel could be ruled fraudulent. After all, how could a cargo hauler afford a military cruiser? There must have been some mistake in the auction process. It would be better for everyone if he just handed over the codes and walked away. Vera was recording the entire conversation. She quietly informed Jake that his legal ownership was actually solid. The auction had been legitimate, conducted by a licensed government contractor. Overriding that sale would require admitting the cover-up, revealing that Earth's military lost track of a classified vessel for 15 years. Hayes was bluffing. Jake made a choice that surprised even himself. He told Commander Hayes that he would need to think about her offer. Then he cut the communication. Vera immediately started plotting a jump course. She said they had maybe 10 minutes before Hayes decided to board the ship by force. The Valiant Dawn's engines came online for the first time in 15 years. The reactor purred like it had never been shut down. Vera guided Jake through the startup sequence, her knowledge of the ship's system saving precious minutes. The military cruisers moved to intercept, but Vera knew all their protocols, all their standard formations. She had been designed to fight ships exactly like these. They slipped through a gap in the perimeter, using the station's bulk to shield them from targeting sensors. Commander Hayes was shouting over the communication channel, threatening criminal charges, promising that Jake would spend the rest of his life in prison. Vera jumped the ship to hyperspace 3 seconds before the military vessels could get a weapons lock. They came out of hyperspace near a neutral trading station in the border territories. Jake's hands were shaking. He had just run from Earth's military. There was no going back from this. Vera reminded him that he had not actually committed any crime. He owned the ship legally, but she agreed that Hayes would not see it that way. Jake needed money and information. He decided to sell one of the precursor devices to fund their escape. The trading station was neutral ground where questions were not asked. He docked the Valiant Dawn in a private bay and took one of the smaller devices with him, hiding it in a cargo container. The black market dealers took one look at the device and their eyes went wide. Within an hour, Jake had 3 offers, each one more ridiculous than the last. One dealer offered him 100,000 credits on the spot. Another wanted to trade him a small station. A third pulled a weapon and tried to take it by force. Jake barely made it back to the ship. That was when he met Claire Bennett. She approached him in the docking bay, seemingly unarmed, with her hands visible. She was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She said she was a freelance archaeologist who specialized in precursor civilizations. She had been tracking rumors of the Valiant Dawn for years. Claire said she knew about the mission, about what the crew found on that dead world. She claimed to have research that might help them access the vault. She wanted to study the precursor technology, to understand it properly instead of just selling it to the highest bidder. She made it sound noble, like they would be preserving history together. Vera advised against trusting her. Too convenient, she said. Too many people suddenly interested in a ship that had been lost for 15 years. But Jake was desperate for answers. Claire seemed genuine. He made what would turn out to be his second big mistake. He let her come aboard. Claire was friendly and helpful for exactly 6 hours. She studied the containers in the cargo bay, took scans of the vault door, and asked 100 questions about the ship's history. She shared her research on precursor sites, showing Jake evidence of similar technology found on half a dozen worlds. It all seemed legitimate. Then they jumped to their next destination and Claire made her move. Jake woke up in his quarters with his head pounding. He had been drugged. He tried to stand and realized his hands were bound with security restraints. Through the door he could hear sounds from the cargo bay, the screech of cutting equipment on metal. Vera's hologram appeared next to him. She looked angry, which Jake had not known was possible for an artificial intelligence. She said Claire had locked her out of the cargo bay systems and was trying to force open the vault using plasma cutters. Vera could not physically stop her, but she had one option. The ship's security protocol included a knockout gas system for exactly this kind of situation. Vera triggered it. Jake heard Claire's cursing cut off abruptly. By the time he managed to cut through his restraints and get to the cargo bay, Claire was unconscious on the floor. The vault door was scorched but intact. Jake wanted to throw her out the airlock. Vera suggested checking Claire's equipment first. They found a communication device hidden in her pack, still transmitting. She had been sending data back to someone. Vera traced the signal. It led to a corporate consortium based in the outer colonies, the kind of company that specialized in weapons development. Worse, Claire had uploaded a virus into Vera's systems before making her move. The virus was spreading, corrupting core functions. Vera said she could fight it, but it would take time. She was already losing access to some systems. Jake worked frantically to isolate the infected sections, but he was not a programmer. He was barely keeping ahead of the damage. In the middle of the crisis, Vera recovered a critical memory fragment. The corruption triggered something in her storage that had been locked away. She suddenly remembered what the crew had found on that dead world. The precursor sites were not archaeological treasures. They were weapons platforms designed to terraform entire star systems. The crew had discovered that someone or something was activating the platforms across the galaxy. The Krell had not started the war with humanity. They had been fleeing from something, running from the activation sequence. Humanity and the Krell had stumbled into a much larger conflict without even knowing it. Jake asked the obvious question. What were the platforms terraforming into? Vera said the data was unclear, but it was not creating habitable worlds. The process would sterilize everything, reducing planets to their basic elements before rebuilding them into something else. The crew had estimated humanity had maybe a year before the nearest platform reached Earth's sector. That was why they had gone dark. That was why they had hidden the ship. They needed time to figure out how to stop it. The vault contained the command codes to shut down the entire network, or to control it. The Valiant Dawn was not just a ship. It was a mobile command center for managing precursor technology. Jake finally managed to purge the virus from Vera's core systems. She came back online fully, her hologram solidifying. She pulled up the Vault Access Protocol. They had been trying to solve it the wrong way. The code was not in the ship's computer. It was biological, keyed to the captain's DNA. Jake remembered the life sign readings in the vault's memory. He asked Vera if those were crew members. She said yes, 3 survivors from the original mission preserved in cryogenic suspension. One of them was Captain Richard Dalton. They could revive him, but the process was risky. 15 years in cryo was a long time. There was no guarantee he would survive. Jake made the call. They needed the captain's knowledge more than they needed to play it safe. He helped Vera prep the medical bay. The revival process took 2 hours. Captain Dalton came out of it slowly, his body fighting against consciousness. He was in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much. When his eyes finally opened, the first thing he said was to ask if they had stopped it. Jake told him they had not stopped anything. They had barely figured out what it was. Dalton sat up slowly, taking in the medical bay, recognizing Vera's hologram. He asked how long he had been under. When Jake said 15 years, Dalton closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he asked about the rest of his crew. Vera said 2 more crew members were in cryo. The rest had not made it into the pods. Dalton nodded like he had expected that answer. He asked what had happened to the ship. Jake explained about the auction, about Earth's military trying to reclaim it, about Claire and the corporate consortium. Dalton listened without interrupting. When Jake finished, Dalton stood up and walked to the viewport. He looked out at the stars for a long time. Then he said they needed to open the vault. There were things Jake needed to understand. The precursor civilization had not died out. They had evolved beyond physical form, leaving their technology behind as a test for younger species. The terraforming platforms were evolutionary catalysts. They forced rapid advancement through controlled catastrophe. Species either developed the technology to survive or they did not. Humanity and the Krell had triggered the test by expanding into space too quickly, without understanding what they were activating. But there was a catch. The test had a failure condition. If species did not reach a certain technological threshold before the full activation sequence completed, the platforms would sterilize their home worlds and reset the experiment. Dalton's crew had calculated the timeline. Earth and the Krell home world were both marked for cleansing in less than 3 months. Jake felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. 3 months. Billions of lives. Dalton went to the cargo bay and placed his hand on the vault's security panel. The door recognized his DNA and began cycling through its unlock sequence. The massive door swung open with a hiss of pressure equalizing. Inside was a control station unlike anything Jake had seen. Holographic displays showing hundreds of precursor sites across multiple star systems. Each site had a status indicator, most of them showing active or activating. The control codes were there, complex strings of data that could shut down individual platforms or override the entire network. Viera's sensors detected incoming ships before Dalton could explain more. Multiple vessels converging on their position from different vectors. Earth military forces, Krell warships, and something else. Unknown vessels using energy signatures that matched the precursor technology. Commander Hayes arrived first, her fleet dropping out of hyperspace with weapons charged. She broadcast on all frequencies, demanding that Jake surrender the Valiant Dawn immediately. This was his last chance to cooperate before she classified him as a hostile and opened fire. The Krell ships arrived seconds later. Their commander, a being named Thrak, opened a communication channel. His voice was translated by the ship's computer, coming through as a deep rumble. He said his people had been searching for the Valiant Dawn for years, knowing it held the key to stopping the precursor network that threatened them all. The unknown vessels revealed themselves last. They were automated, controlled by artificial intelligence that claimed to be remnants of species that had failed the precursor test generations ago. The machines had been repurposed as enforcers, ensuring that the test continued as designed. They demanded the Valiant Dawn be destroyed to prevent interference with the protocols. Jake stood on the bridge surrounded by holographic displays showing 3 different fleets, each one capable of destroying his ship. Hayes wanted the technology for Earth's military. Thrak wanted it to save the Krell. The machines wanted to preserve the test. Everyone saw only their own survival, their own agenda. Dalton stood next to him and said this was why they had hidden the ship. The moment anyone got control of the codes, they would use them for their own benefit. Shutting down the network would save lives in the short term, but it would not stop the test. The precursor civilization had built-in redundancies. The platforms would reactivate eventually, maybe in a decade, maybe in a century. Handing control to one faction would create a weapon more powerful than anything in the galaxy. Whoever controlled the network could terraform entire worlds at will. It would make them gods. Dalton said his crew had spent months trying to find a solution. They had found one, but it meant giving up control entirely. The precursor civilization had built a failsafe into their own test, a protocol that transformed the challenge from survival through conflict to survival through cooperation. It changed the platforms from weapons into tools, offering genuine transcendence, but only if multiple species worked together to achieve it. Jake asked what would happen if he activated the failsafe. Dalton said the technology would become open source, shared equally among all species. No government could monopolize it. No military could weaponize it. The test would continue, but the parameters would change. Species would have to cooperate or face extinction together. The 3 fleets were moving into attack positions. Hayes had run out of patience. Thrak was preparing his weapons. The automated enforcers were charging their precursor-based systems. Jake had maybe 60 seconds before someone started shooting. He made his choice. He activated the failsafe. The vault's control station lit up with activity. Data streamed out from the Valiant Dawn on every frequency, every communication channel. The precursor network received the new protocols and began reconfiguring. Across the galaxy, the platforms shifted their programming, the terraforming process changing into something else entirely. Jake broadcast everything openly. Technical specifications, historical data, the complete map of every precursor site in known space. He made it impossible for any single entity to control the information. The data flooded through Earth's networks, through Krell's systems, through every communication hub in the sector. Commander Hayes screamed at him over the communication channel. He had just committed treason, violated a dozen security protocols, potentially armed every hostile power in the galaxy. She was going to make sure he spent the rest of his life in prison. Jake cut the channel. He had more important things to worry about. The automated enforcers powered down their weapons. Their programming recognized the failsafe protocol. The test parameters had changed. Their mission was complete. The machines departed without another word. Thrak's ships held position, waiting to see what would happen next. Across human space, scientists were already analyzing the data. Research teams were forming, reaching out to Krell counterparts, beginning the work of understanding the technology they had just inherited. The precursor platforms were still active, still dangerous, but the immediate threat of planetary sterilization had been lifted. The new protocols gave them time. Jake sat in the captain's chair and realized what he had just done. He was now wanted by Earth's government, probably hunted by multiple intelligence agencies. He had made himself the most famous and most hated person in human space, all in the span of about 5 minutes. There was no going back to his old life. Dalton clapped him on the shoulder and said he had made the right choice. It was the same decision Dalton's crew had been prepared to make 15 years ago, before everything went wrong. Jake asked what happened back then. Dalton said they were betrayed by someone they trusted, someone who wanted the technology for themselves. Most of the crew died fighting to keep the codes from being stolen. The survivors went into cryo hoping someone would find the ship eventually, someone who would make the right call. Dalton looked around the bridge of the Valiant Dawn and said he was staying. The ship was his home. If Jake was willing to have an old soldier aboard, Dalton would help him navigate the mess they had just created. Vera integrated herself fully with the ship's systems, making the Valiant Dawn more capable than ever. She said she had been designed to fight wars, but she much preferred this, being part of something that might actually save lives instead of taking them. Claire woke up in the brig, secured behind a force field. Jake told her what had happened, how the information was now public knowledge. Her employers would not pay for data everyone already had. She had lost. Claire smiled bitterly and said he had no idea what he had done. By making the technology public, he had just started a race. Every government, every corporation, every research institution would be scrambling to exploit it first. Jake said that was fine. Let them race. At least it would not be a secret controlled by people like her employers. Claire asked what he was going to do with her. Jake thought about it and realized he could not just keep her locked up forever. He decided to drop her at the nearest station and let her go. She was a symptom of a bigger problem, not the problem itself. After they released her, Claire surprised him by asking to stay. She said she actually was an archaeologist, or had been before the corporation recruited her. She wanted to study the precursor sites properly, to understand the civilization that built them. Not for profit, but for knowledge. Jake did not trust her, but Dalton pointed out they needed someone who understood the academic side of what they were dealing with. They set course for the nearest precursor site, a platform orbiting a dead star in neutral space. Already, ships from a dozen different species were converging on it. Research vessels mostly, but some military craft as well. The galaxy was responding faster than Jake had expected. Commander Hayes sent one final transmission before they jumped to hyperspace. She said Jake had made powerful enemies today. Earth's government would not forget this. Neither would a lot of other governments. But she also admitted quietly that he might have been right. The technology was too important to be controlled by any one faction. She did not say she forgave him, but she said she understood. Thrak contacted them as well. He said the Krell Assembly was grateful for what Jake had done, even if they could not officially acknowledge it. His people had been running from the precursor threat for longer than humans knew. Having a chance to actually understand it, to work with other species on solving it, was worth more than any military advantage. Jake stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn and watched the stars stream past in hyperspace. A week ago, he had been a broke cargo hauler trying to scrape together enough credits for his next meal. Now he owned a ship worth more than some planetary economies, had access to technology that could reshape civilizations, and was wanted by multiple governments. He asked Vera if she thought he had made the right choice. She said there was no way to know yet. The fail-safe protocol would change everything, but change was not always good. Species would have to learn to cooperate, to share knowledge instead of hoarding it. That went against every evolutionary instinct. It might work, or it might lead to chaos. Dalton said the precursor civilization had faced the same choice millions of years ago. They chose to transcend, to evolve beyond physical limitations. But they left their technology behind as a test because they understood that transcendence only meant something if you earned it. You could not force species to cooperate. You could only create conditions where cooperation was the only path to survival. Jake thought about the empty auction hall, about raising his hand for a ship that nobody else wanted. He had bought a mystery for 5,000 credits and ended up with the responsibility for potentially saving billions of lives, or destroying them if this went wrong. The weight of it was crushing. Then he thought about all those ships heading toward the precursor sites. Humans and Krell and dozens of other species, all going to study the same technology, all forced to share information because he had made it impossible to keep secrets. Maybe it would work. Maybe species could learn to cooperate when the alternative was extinction. The Valiant Dawn dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the dead star system. The precursor platform hung in orbit like a massive geometric flower, its surfaces shifting through colors that should not exist. Dozens of ships surrounded it, maintaining careful distances from each other but all focused on the same goal. Jake received communication requests from research teams representing 7 different species. They wanted to coordinate their studies, to share data, to work together. It was messy and complicated and full of mistrust, but it was happening. Species that had been at war 15 years ago were now exchanging scientific information. Dalton said this was just the beginning. There were hundreds of precursor sites across the galaxy. Each one would require decades of study. The fail-safe protocol had bought them time, but it had not solved everything. Species would still compete, still struggle for advantage. But now they had a common challenge that was bigger than their individual conflicts. Jake authorized the Valiant Dawn sensors to begin scanning the platform. The data would be automatically shared with every ship in the system. He was still getting used to the idea of not keeping secrets. It felt wrong, like giving away an advantage, but it was also liberating. He did not have to protect information anymore. He just had to help people understand it. Claire was in the science lab, already deep in analysis of the platform's structure. She looked different without the corporate agenda driving her, more focused, more genuine. She called up to the bridge and said the platform was responding to their presence, activating systems that had been dormant. It was like it wanted to be studied, wanted to share its knowledge. Vera detected a signal coming from deep inside the platform. It was a message, encoded in a way that any technological species could decipher. The precursor civilization had left instructions, a guide for passing the test. The message was simple but profound. It said that survival was not about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about recognizing that you were part of something larger than yourself. The precursors had learned that lesson the hard way. They had fought themselves nearly to extinction before understanding that their real enemy was isolation, the belief that they could succeed alone. Their technology was meant to force other species to learn the same lesson faster, before it was too late. Jake read the message 3 times. It felt like it was speaking directly to him. He had spent his whole life alone, trusting no one, trying to make it on his own. Even buying the Valiant Dawn had been about getting enough money to be independent. But independence had not saved him. Working with Vera and Dalton, even reluctantly cooperating with Claire, that was what had actually made a difference. He broadcast the precursor message to all the ships in the system. Within minutes, it was spreading through the galaxy, translated into hundreds of languages, discussed by billions of beings. The test was no longer a secret. Everyone now knew what the precursors wanted them to learn. Commander Hayes sent another message. She said Earth's government was establishing a joint research council with representatives from multiple species. They wanted Jake to serve as an advisor, given his unique understanding of the situation. Came with full amnesty for his earlier actions. He would still be controversial, still have enemies, but at least he would not be a fugitive. Jake declined. He said the council did not need his advice. They needed to figure this out themselves, all the species working together. He would keep exploring precursor sites, keep sharing information, but he was not going to be anyone's advisor or spokesman. The Valiant Dawn was his ship now, and he was going to use it the way it was meant to be used. Dalton approved of that decision. He said the moment Jake became part of the official structure, he would lose the freedom to make hard choices. Better to stay independent, to be a voice that governments could not silence or control. The precursor technology was too important to be managed by bureaucrats. Over the next few weeks, Jake and his crew visited 3 more precursor sites. Each one revealed new information about the ancient civilization. They had been biological once, not so different from humans or Krell. They had fought wars, built empires, nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. Then they found a way to transcend, to become something beyond physical form. But transcendence came with a cost. They could no longer directly interact with the physical universe. They could only observe, only guide through the technology they had left behind. The platforms, the tests, all of it was their way of helping younger species avoid the mistakes they had made. They wanted others to achieve transcendence through cooperation, not through the brutal path they had taken. Jake wondered what transcendence actually meant. Vera said the data suggested it was a form of collective consciousness. Billions of individuals merged into a single entity while somehow maintaining their individuality. It sounded wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. She asked if he would want that if humans ever developed the capability. Jake said he did not know. Right now he was more worried about making sure humanity survived long enough to have that choice. The failsafe protocol had given them breathing room, but the platforms were still active, still testing. If species did not make progress toward cooperation, the test would resume. The precursors were patient, but they were not infinitely forgiving. Claire made a breakthrough at the 4th site. She discovered that the platforms could be reprogrammed, not to change their core function, but to adjust the parameters of the test. Species could choose their own challenges, their own paths to transcendence. The precursors had built in flexibility, recognizing that different civilizations would need different approaches. That information changed everything. It meant species were not locked into a single path. They could experiment, could find what worked for them. The Cooperative Research Council immediately began discussions about how to use this capability. For the first time, Jake felt genuine hope that this might actually work. He received a personal message from Thrak. The Krell commander said his government wanted to thank Jake properly. They were naming a research station after him, the first joint Krell-human facility ever established. It would be dedicated to studying precursor technology and promoting cooperation between species. Thrak said it was a small gesture but meaningful to his people. Jake did not know how to respond to that. He was not a hero. He was just a guy who made a choice, who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place depending on how you looked at it. He sent back a simple message saying he was honored and hoped the station did good work. Months passed. The Valiant Dawn became a fixture at precursor sites across the galaxy. Other ships would arrive to find Jake and his crew already there, sensors running, data being broadcast freely. Some captains were grateful. Others were suspicious, convinced Jake had an angle he was not sharing. He got used to the mistrust. Dalton revived the other two crew members from cryo. Both were scientists who had specialized in precursor technology. They integrated into the mission immediately, excited to continue work that had been interrupted 15 years ago. The Valiant Dawn felt less like a ghost ship and more like a home. Vera continued to evolve, her programming adapting to the wealth of new information they were gathering. She became less of a tactical AI and more of a research assistant, helping coordinate data analysis across multiple scientific teams. She said it was the most fulfilled she had felt since being activated. Claire proved her worth repeatedly, deciphering precursor codes that had stumped other researchers. She had a gift for understanding alien logic patterns. Jake still did not fully trust her, but he respected her skills. She had earned her place on the crew. 1 year after Jake bought the Valiant Dawn at auction, the Cooperative Research Council published its first major findings. They had successfully modified a precursor platform to create a new type of energy source, clean and virtually unlimited. The technology was immediately shared with all member species. It was not transcendence, but it was progress. Jake watched the announcement from the bridge of his ship. Billions of people were celebrating, talking about a new era of cooperation and shared prosperity. He felt a strange disconnect. All of this had started because he was broke and desperate, willing to take a chance on a mysteriously cheap ship at auction. Dalton asked him if he regretted it. Jake thought about everything that had happened. He had gone from being nobody to being one of the most influential people in the galaxy. He could never go back to his old life. He would always be looking over his shoulder for enemies. But he had also been part of something that might actually matter, that might save countless lives. He said no, he did not regret it. Given the choice, he would do it all again. Dalton smiled and said that was the right answer. The precursor test was not just about technology. It was about character, about being willing to do what was right even when it cost you everything. Jake looked out at the stars and thought about the precursor civilization, about beings who had transcended physical form millions of years ago, but still cared enough to help younger species avoid their mistakes. He wondered if humanity would ever reach that level, if cooperation would become natural instead of forced. Vera said the data suggested it was possible. Species that passed the test successfully all showed similar patterns. Initial resistance, gradual acceptance, eventual integration of cooperation into their core values. Humanity was following that path. So were the Krell and dozens of other species. The process was messy and slow, but it was happening. A new message came through from the Research Council. They had discovered another precursor site, this one different from the others. It was not a platform or a weapon. It appeared to be a library, containing the complete history of the precursor civilization. They wanted the Valiant Dawn to investigate. Jake set course immediately. A library would contain answers to questions they had not even thought to ask yet. Understanding the precursors better might help them understand the test, might show them what they were working toward. As the Valiant Dawn jumped to hyperspace, Jake reflected on how far he had come. A year ago he had 5,000 credits and a failing cargo hauler. Now he commanded the most important ship in the galaxy, worked with the best scientific minds across multiple species, and had a purpose that extended beyond just surviving day to day. He still was not sure he believed in destiny or fate, but he had to admit that buying a mysterious ship at an empty auction had turned out to be the best decision he ever made, even if it meant he would never have a quiet life again. Even if it meant constantly dealing with threats and responsibilities that felt too big for one person. The precursor library awaited them, full of secrets and knowledge. Whatever they found there would change everything again. That was becoming a pattern in Jake's life. Constant change, constant challenges, constant opportunities to make decisions that affected billions of lives. Dalton said that was the real test, not the platforms, not the technology. The test was whether individuals could handle the responsibility of having power without being corrupted by it. The precursors wanted to know if younger species could be trusted with transcendence, or if they would use it to dominate and destroy. Jake understood that now. Every choice he made, Every decision about what to share and what to protect was part of demonstrating that humanity could be trusted, that they could have access to incredible power and not abuse it. It was exhausting and terrifying, but it was also the most important work anyone could do. The Valiant Dawn dropped out of hyperspace at the coordinates provided by the Research Council. The precursor library hung in space like a massive crystalline structure, glowing with internal light. It was beautiful and alien and full of promise. Jake authorized the approach, ready to learn whatever the ancient civilization wanted to teach them. Whatever came next, he would face it the same way he had faced everything since buying this ship, with honesty, with courage, and with the understanding that he was not alone. He had a crew, he had allies across multiple species, and he had the backing of billions of people who wanted cooperation to succeed. The empty auction that gave him a galactic cruiser had also given him a purpose. What he discovered inside had changed the galaxy, and what he would discover next might change it again. Jake Morrison was ready for that challenge. He had come a long way from being a broke cargo hauler, and his journey was just beginning.